Okay, so what we're going to do now that we've had a chance to explore the turning Y here on the east side of Jellico, we're going to make our way further to the west here into Jellico. I'm going to ride a little bit slowly. I had to finish my story about sort of the history of the line. And so again, Jellico was the divisional point. Now, unfortunately for Canadian Northern Railway, this line opened in 1915. But because of a lot of financial issues associated with the construction of this line, and then some of the lines that they were building through the mountains of British Columbia, and on top of what was happening with World War I, the Canadian Northern Railway Company began running into financial trouble. And by 1917, the company was essentially bankrupt and had to be taken over by the Canadian government. And so in 1917, they were taken over by the Canadian government, and in 1918 they were forced to merge, amalgamate, whatever descriptor word that you want to use, with a bunch of other Canadian government owned bankrupt lines called the Canadian Government Railways. And so that merger in 1918 produced Canadian National Railways. And so there were some really significant things that happened with regard to the merger with Canadian, or the formation of Canadian National Railways. Now I'm going to pause here for a second. Around here is supposed to be a milepost marker. So on the final iteration of the line, so the Kinghorn subdivision, which ran from Long Lac, and I'll talk a little bit more about Long Lac in a second, to Port Arthur and then eventually Thunder Bay, this was milepost 49. So the milepost 49 marker was supposed to be here. Now, getting back to our story. So again, Jellico was a divisional point, and so when the formation of Canadian National Railways happened, the name of this line, the running between Hornpain and Jellico, changed. It had been called the Long Lake Subdivision, and eventually its name changed to the Long Lac Subdivision, which was named after the community of Long Lac, which was not its original name. It was basically an English corruption of the original French name, Long Lac, which had been named by the early French explorers, based on its sort of geography and things like that. And that name was changed too, because originally it was supposed to be called Kanagami, what the indigenous people called the river in the area. Anyway, so this line for a few years continued to be the Nipigon subdivision. This line changed its name to the Long Lac subdivision. In 1923, the merger between or the creation of Canadian National Railways was completed with the incorporation of the Grand Trunk lines. And so again, we had Long Lac subdivision, Nipigon subdivision, but at that time there was something really significant that Canadian National Railways was undertaking, and that was the construction of a piece of railway line called the Nakina Cutoff. And basically the Nakina Cutoff ran from Long Lac, which we just finished talking about, to a place called Nakina. Now, what that essentially was it was a way of joining two railway lines. So basically you had the Canadian Northern Railway, which was a transcontinental line, and then CN had also inherited the National Transcontinental Grand Trunk Pacific line. And at Long Lac, the two lines were about 30 miles apart. And so what Canadian National decided to do was basically decided to build a section of railway line between the two lines called the Nakina Cutoff. And what that would do is it would basically allow trains, for example, traveling from Toronto, they would travel up the Canadian Northern Line, hit Long Lac, go up the cutoff, and I'll be showing a map as we describe this, go up the cutoff to Nakina, and then basically cross over onto the National Transcontinental Line and make their way to Winnipeg. And the reason why they wanted to do that is because the route, using that route, would basically cut 100 miles off the journey to Winnipeg, because essentially the route was straighter and the grades were better, because traveling on the Canadian Northern Line, you basically had to go downhill towards Lake Superior, eventually reaching Port Arthur, and then you had to come back uphill as you headed west towards Winnipeg. And so that had some very profound changes on this line. What it did was it basically relegated everything west of Long Lac to what we call secondary status. It was no longer part of the main line. So the line from Long Lac to Jellicoe, its name was changed. It became known as the Kinghorn Subdivision, named after Kinghorn Station, which is just to the east of us. So Long Lac to Jellicoe became the Kinghorn Subdivision. The line from Jellicoe to Port Arthur changed its name as well, because the Canadian Pacific had a Nipigon subdivision, and so in order to avoid confusion, they changed the name of that line to the Dorion subdivision. And so you had the Kinghorn subdivision, you had the Dorion subdivision, and that all kind of that all happened. So the Nipigon subdivision was renamed in 1923. This line became the Kinghorn subdivision in 1925. That continued until 1960. So what happened in 1960, and sorry to interrupt here, is where everything starts to widen out. We're going to talk about this in the next segment, but basically we have the piece of the turning Y coming in here, and then you can see everything opens up here with the yard here at Jellicoe. Everything continued until 1960, when Canadian National Railways basically went through a big sort of transformation that year. They changed their name from Canadian National Railways, plural, to Canadian National Railway, adopted their modern sort of worm logo, as they call it. And what they did was they basically amalgamated a lot of lines, and this was one of them. So the Kinghorn subdivision and the Dorion subdivision were merged into one line from Long Lac to, at the time, Port Arthur, and eventually became Thunder Bay. And so one of the kind of interesting things about all of this is it creates a lot of issues with mileage. Because on the original line, so the original line that ran from Hornpain to Jellicoe, the Long Lake subdivision, all the mileage was measured from Hornpain to Jellicoe, and then obviously there was a different set of mileage, and then everything got sort of changed in 1925 when they sort of rejiggled lines, and then rejiggled again in 1960 when they merged the lines, and that's why there's sort of discrepancies in some of the mileage. I always use the original Canadian Northern mileage, and so I measure this line, so the original Long Lake subdivision, from basically the mileage from Hornpain to Jellicoe, and then I use the Nipigon subdivision mileage from Jellicoe to Port Arthur. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to hold up here for a second, and then what we're going to do is we're going to continue working our way to the west, and then there's going to be a lot more sort of stuff happening as we get into the yard proper here in Jellicoe. So before we begin our westward journey, again, there's lots of stuff to see in Jellicoe. So what we're going to do is we're going to head down this little trail here. You're going to see to this, running to the south. Hopefully you're not getting too much glare in the on the screen. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be checking out the first of two section houses here in Jellicoe, the eastern section house. And before we do that, I'm going to show you up a little map again here, just to kind of orient yourself. All right, so we've made our way over here to the eastern section house. We are probably about a few hundred meters south of the railway grade. Many thanks to Richard for allowing me to kind of walk around the property here and take some video. So I'm not sure what some of the other the only other section house that we have, that there's the western one over here that's standing, but the one in Pass Lake is still standing. It seems like some of them are a little different. Just by looking at the foundation of this one, it sort of resembles the one that I've seen at Kinghorn. You can see it is a two-story structure, a concrete foundation. You can see there are some outbuildings. Again, I don't know if those are original. You can see the red brick chimney, which, if we take a look, maybe I'll post a link to the one at Kemo. Sorry, the one at Kinghorn, and you can actually see the remains of the brick chimney. And so there were places on the railway line where there would have been two section houses in close proximity. Basically, this would have essentially covered everything on the railway grade to the east towards Kinghorn. And again, there was a section house at Kinghorn, and then the one on the western side of Jellicoe would have covered everything kind of to the working the way to the west towards Beardmore. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to hop back up on the grade and just continue working our way west through the railway yard here at Jellicoe. Okay, so we're going to hop up on the bike here and we're going to start making our way through this part of the yard. So again, this is where the turning Y, the eastern turning Y, comes out right here and rejoins the grade. This is Coleman Lake. Lots of little sort of glacial features in this area. There's a major river that kind of runs just to the south here that starts up kind of sandwiched in between rivers. There's a Sturgeon River to the north, and then eventually the Blackwater River to the south. And you get lots of these little sort of glacial lakes and lots of little till ridges and things like that. Down here, that's the base for the power line. So there were two lines that used to parallel this railway. So on the north side was the telegraph line. Sorry, it's really windy here. And on the south side was a power line. Or that could have been the telegraph line. Sometimes they switch them sort of back and forth. Wow, a little bumpy through here. And so basically here you have a lot of things happening, because you have the main railway line and you have the start of siding here. And so again, this was a very, very busy place for a lot of years. Maybe less so after the construction of the cutoff, because it wasn't part of the main line anymore, but certainly as a divisional point. And so it was a divisional point from 1915 until 1960, and even after 1960 until the railway line was discontinued in 2005, and the rails were pulled up afterwards, so between 2008 and 2010. So from 1960 to 2005, this was actually a crew change point. And so basically the trains used to run eastbound. They would run from Hornpain through here to Jellicoe, and then they would change crews. And then the eastbound trains would run from Port Arthur, eventually Thunder Bay, to here, and then again change crews. It's a little windy, obviously very wide open here. As I mentioned, this line was basically a secondary line. And therefore there wasn't a lot of traffic on this line. So beginning in the 1940s, basically there was only 2 trains a day, one eastbound, one westbound on this line. It's hard pedaling through the ballast here. And one of the main reasons why CN kept this line, kept the Kinghorn, was essentially it provided kind of a redundancy in case something happened to the main line. And in the early 2000s, as CN began to expand and buy up rail lines through the US, that need eventually disappeared. and it's the reason why eventually CN discontinued service on this line and pulled up the rails. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to pause here, and you can see how everything begins to sort of open up here, and there's going to be a lot we have to do. We're going to continue part of our journey here along where the main tracks were. I'm going to show you where the station is. There's a more modern bunkhouse that's there, and then eventually there's another turning Y, and then eventually the road reaches the highway, where we pick up with another exploration that we did. But then this was basically the yard here, and so you had multiple rail lines, and then up ahead over there, you can see inside the tree line, there was basically a track that ran up, allowed trains to access the coal chute that was here, or the coal tower, and then there was a water tank, and then there's the turntable and the roundhouse. So we're gonna explore all of those things.